Okay, good morning, everyone. All right, let's go ahead and start with prayers. Were you going to lead the refuge prayer, Nancy? Or okay. So again, in this prayer, we're just simply directing our minds to these two thoughts: the thought of refuge, finding safe direction in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, especially the Dharma, the teachings of the Buddha that we're following. And then in the last two lines, generating the motivation of bodhicitta, the wish to develop ourselves completely so we can then be of benefit to other beings. So thank you for leading us in the prayer then, Nancy.
Taking refuge and generating bodhicitta, once in English, twice in Tibetan. I go for refuge until I am enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merits I create through listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. Sangye Chodang Soki Choknam La Changchu Bardu Dagni Kapsuchi Dagi Chunyan Gepe Sonam Gi Drola Penchir Sangye Druparsho Sangye Chodang Soki Choknam La Changchu Bardu Dagni Kapsuchi Dagi Chunyan Gepe Sonam Gi Drola Penchir Sangye Druparsho.
Okay, thank you, Nancy, for leading the prayers. And let's go ahead and do a short meditation. I always like to start with just an opportunity for us to be silent for a few minutes together. First, focusing on the breath just to calm our minds. So if you're new to meditation, just bring the awareness to the breath. There's a number of ways to do this. The one I usually recommend is by focusing on the area around the nostrils. As you breathe in, as you breathe out, there's that subtle sensation that occurs right in that area. Just kind of make that your meditation object. Just try to stay present with that sensation as best as you can. But no doubt the mind will wander, and when that happens and we see that we've wandered away from the breath, then just simply let go of whatever was distracting you and gently guide the mind back to the breath. So we'll do this in silence for a few minutes, and then I will come in and I'll lead you in a short reflection to reinforce our motivation of bodhicitta for the day. So we can begin the meditation now. And now to set our motivation for today. This session is going to be about how we tend to ourselves in the best way, especially in regard to our spiritual practice. Now, in Buddhism, our spiritual practice essentially comes down to two main things. We are first trying to eliminate, at least reduce to some degree, the negative tendencies that we have. The minds of anger, jealousy, greed, ignorance, all of these things that kind of keep us from achieving our true potential. And of course, are problematic for ourselves, but also for others in our world. And then the other task, which is the opposing force, which is to develop all of the positive qualities: compassion, loving kindness, patience, generosity, wisdom. This is the essence of our spiritual practice, is to work on these two in tandem. Through more positive states of mind, we reduce and eventually get rid of the negative tendencies. So this is hard work. This is not something that is easy to do. Yet often we are hard on ourselves in doing this hard work. So maybe before we set our motivation, think about what you do, first of all, to support yourself in very positive ways around your spiritual practice. Now try to get in touch with that. We'll be discussing it more. But it's useful to acknowledge to ourselves the ways in which we do treat ourselves with friendship, with compassion, with kindness. So take a moment to reflect on that. And then also to acknowledge the ways in which perhaps we aren't as kind to ourselves as what we might be, to recognize some of our deficiencies or shortcomings in regard to how we treat ourselves. So maybe reflect on those, and not, again, using that as a tool to beat yourself up further, just to acknowledge that we're here today in part to examine those tendencies, to see how we might change things so that we can have more success in our spiritual practice, be happier within our spiritual practice. So just take a minute or so to reflect on the ways in which you perhaps are lacking some skill in being friends with yourself. So, in essence, then, we are here today to examine this topic with that understanding that while we do have some ability to treat ourselves well on the spiritual path, we all have our own you know, shortcomings in regard to this, our ways in which we are not as skillful as what we'd like to be. And so, set that motivation to be here today to do this work, to examine this topic, initially for your own benefit, because the more that you are able to have a spirit of joy and happiness within your spiritual practice, the more that you will be driving towards achieving the goals of this practice. And when you achieve the goals of this practice, of course, then you will also be fully qualified to help others to do this work, attaining the state of a Buddha, an enlightened being. so you then can work perfectly to help others in their spiritual development. So hold this motivation for the work we're going to do today in examining this topic. So everything we do becomes a cause for that result, the achievement of our own potential, so we can help others to achieve theirs. And then you can open your eyes fully and we'll begin. So thank you all again for coming today. This is my fourth and final talk of this month. I was so happy to be here these 4 Sundays and be able to share some of these teachings, one-off teachings that I've done sometimes many years ago. Today is a topic I think I did originally back in 2008 for Thupten Norbuling when I was resident teacher, probably over on Alameda Street. Some of you remember that center, that building. So this is, again, a talk that I was inspired to do on the basis of some reading I had done of a Tibetan practitioner named John Wellwood, a book called Toward a Psychology of Awakening. He's a psychologist as well. And he brings up a lot of good points. As a Westerner who's practicing Buddhism, he's identified a lot of things that are within the scope of Western psychology, but also applied to Buddhist practice. And so I'm what he shares in terms of the book, and there's a few passages that are particularly relevant to the subject that we're talking about today. But I was inspired initially by this phrase that he uses. I don't know much about Western psychology. I have to admit it's one of my weak points. I need to work up on that, know a lot more about Buddhist psychology. But there's this idea of the superego that is taught initially by Freud. And he applies it to our spiritual practice. He says, another major problem for Western seekers is their susceptibility to the spiritual superego, a harsh inner voice that acts as a relentless critic and judge, telling them that nothing they do is ever quite good enough. Does this sound familiar to anybody in the room? I mean, again, I think we have moments of joy and support when we actually treat ourselves well, but we tend to have this voice as well, right? You should meditate more and practice harder. You're too self-centered. You don't have enough devotion. The critical voice keeps track of every failure to practice or live up to the teaching so that practice becomes more oriented toward propitiating this judgmental part of themselves than opening unconditionally to life. I think this is the dilemma that we face is that we are actually, not our best friends when we're following those sorts of voices. Maybe we needed those kinds of voices when we were quite young and we weren't so disciplined. But the idea is that if we treat ourselves like that, it's not going to be really advantageous for our spiritual practice. We might get occasionally even words that are in that vein from some of our spiritual teachers, but they're always couched within a more compassionate spirit. So what we're going to look at today is kind of where does this voice come from? What are the things that I've identified and using other teachings I've encountered as well that feed into this? And then look at each of those things and come up with some antidotes to those, some ways of working with each of those. And I try to keep everything I've been doing, especially this month, in a very practical vein. That's how these teachings are meant to be used, essentially, is to make sure that we don't just kind of walk out of here feeling good about a teaching and then do nothing with them. My hope for today is that you'll walk away from here perhaps with some tools, some understanding that you can apply to your life so that you can make sure that when you treat yourself in regard to your spiritual practice, the things you say to yourself and so on, that self-talk, self-language, that you make sure that you are doing that in as kind and compassionate a way as possible. So that's kind of the aim for today. I hope that I can accomplish that to some degree. So what I've identified is 5 things, essentially, these questions that are on the screen now. Where does that spiritual superego come from? What factors are contributing to that self-critical mind? I think we are in a unique place in the West in terms of, I don't think all of these are necessarily factors that influence people in other cultures, especially when we look at the roots of the teachings in Asia, particularly Tibet, when we're dealing with Tibetan Buddhism. So I've identified, again, 5 things. The very first one is essentially what I call misunderstanding the nature of a spiritual path and what we're really undertaking in our practice. We are engaged in some pretty hard work in the spiritual path in Buddhism. As I mentioned in the motivation today, the essential practice that we are trying to undertake is to reduce all of the negative tendencies that we have in our minds and to eventually eliminate them so that they never occur again, which is pretty outrageous. Again, if you go to a Western therapist and say, I want to get rid of all my anger, so I never have a moment of anger, I never want to be jealous again, I never want to have any of these states of mind that are problematic, Western therapists might say, well, I can help you lessen them, but they might even think that it's unhealthy not to have some of these states of mind. So again, in Buddhism, we're talking about getting rid of those completely. And on the other hand, advancing all the positive qualities to become this incredibly kind, compassionate, loving, wise being that we have essentially the ability to do. But that is our kind of our birthright, is we have a mind that can be developed to those degrees, to completely remove what is negative, to completely advance what is positive. And as many of you know, this is the meaning of the very word that we recited in the prayer today that Nancy led you in. The Tibetan word sangye is the word that was used to depict or to denote the Buddha. When the Sanskrit came into Tibet, Buddha means the awakened one. This is the root of that word. We use bodhicitta, the wish to awaken, the mind of awakening, enlightenment. Essentially, when it was brought into Tibet, they encapsulated it into two words. Sang means to completely purify. Gye means to completely develop. So we completely purify our minds of everything that is negative and unwholesome. We completely develop all of the wholesome, positive qualities. And that's a pretty major undertaking. It's going to take some time. So essentially what we have to do in the initial thing is recognize that part of what we're engaging in is difficult work, and we need to be kind of sensitive to that, to make sure that we aren't beating ourselves up because we're not able to do this so well, because guess what, folks? This is the nature of our minds. Again, in Buddhism too, as well, those of you who are new here today, and by the way, welcome all of you who are new to the center. In Buddhism, essentially we're working with the mind. Mind is a non-material phenomenon in Buddhism. It is interdependent with the brain, but it can subsist without the brain. You have a continuity of mental moments that goes back without any beginning, because every moment of mind is arising from a previous moment of mind, that arising from a previous moment of mind, previous moment of mind. You never find a beginning to mind. So we have beginningless lifetimes, which I know is kind of mind-blowing. We can't really get our heads around that concept. We have been involved in existence, what's called samsara, going from life to life since beginningless time. So we've had minds that have been polluted by these delusions for beginningless time. That's an awful long time, right? We're in this lifetime getting a little more serious about taking a look at our minds, trying to improve the quality of our minds. Well, guess what? We need to take that into consideration. We're talking about doing a pretty major shift in our minds, one that is going to take a lot of effort. So we have to kind of recognize that this attitude of beating ourselves up because we're not able to do it so well is really mistaken, because guess what? It takes a long time to be skillful in working with your minds. Remember when the FPMT, our parent organization, had its office up in Taos, my partner, actually, Patrick, he worked up in the office there as an assistant, and sometimes he would come home and he'd say things like, oh, I can't believe some of these people have been practicing the Dharma for 25, 30 years, and I still see them getting angry and everything. And I'm like going, well, duh. you know, we all still have anger. We all still have the delusions, because 25, 30 years is like a drop in the bucket compared to an eternity of lifetimes that we have lived under the control of these factors. So give yourself a break, folks. This is I'm going to talk more about how we address this, but that's the first thing that really kind of gets in the way. And all these things are interrelated, by the way, all 5 of these. But the very first one, this misunderstanding the nature of a spiritual path, kind of what we're really trying to do. And of course, in the West, we have that very much a right now mentality, right? I want it right now. I want immediate results. So that's not really realistic in the spiritual path in Buddhism. The second one is kind of this negative bias that we do tend to have. We tend to hone in on the negative and not appreciate the positive. This is something that we have developed at a deeper level in the evolution of human beings in this world. And that negative bias is what kept us alive on the plains of the Serengeti and what have you, to be watchful of things that were in some way intruding upon our well-being. But that negative bias has led us to have a lot of negative thoughts towards ourselves as well. And we tend to focus on what we are lacking as opposed to what we have actually accomplished. So that negative bias also is playing a role to some degree. It is definitely giving us this tendency to focus on the faults, the glass half empty, rather than looking at the qualities, the glass half full. I want to share one little passage from John Welwood's book that pertains to this. He says, spiritual seekers who try to be more unemotional, unselfish, or compassionate than they really are often secretly hate themselves for the ways they fail to live up to their high ideals. This makes their spirituality cold and solemn. Their self-hatred was not created by the spiritual teaching, it already existed. We already have some self-denigration, some self-loathing, some putting ourselves down on the basis of our own assessment of ourselves, you know. And so again, that's something we're going to talk about more in the next point as well. But that's because we focus in on what is negative, what is lacking. But by pursuing spirituality in a way that widens the gap between how they are and how they think they should be, they wind up turning exquisite spiritual teachings on compassion and awakening into further fuel for self-hatred and inner bondage. And this is a tricky thing that we can fall into sometimes, is that when we begin this practice of this path and we see these ideals, the bodhisattva ideal, being who's totally dedicated to the welfare of others, living their lives in a very selfless way. Well, that's very admirable and something that we can all aspire to. But it doesn't mean that we have to then, once more, focus on our lacking of what it takes to get there, our inability to be there right now, and accentuate that. Means we have to spend some time acknowledging the good things that we have done. Every one of us has good qualities already, has developed to some degree, some things that will be of benefit in the long run. So we have to be kind to ourselves in that regard and kind of avoid this fault. The next one kind of continues with that vein, but moves it more into this kind of overall thing that we do see in our culture so much, especially in the West. There's an interesting story I'll share in regard to how it's not so common in the East. The prevalence of low self-esteem, even self-contempt and self-loathing in our culture. Now, this is really problematic. And of course, I'm not just talking about it in a spiritual path. We have this tendency even in our culture at large. This is why so many young children, what have you, teenagers, grow up with a lot of difficulty around self-esteem issues. This was a big buzzword in Western psychology apparently some time ago, but it's still obviously a deep problem that many people suffer from, kind of seeing themselves in a very, very negative light. It's quite interesting. The story I wanted to share comes from, and many of you have heard this story perhaps because you've been around Buddhism for a while, but this was back in 1990. And I'm going to share Venerable Thupten Chodron's account of being there. She says, in 1990, I was an observer at a conference of Western scientists and scholars with His Holiness the Dalai Lama in Dharamsala when the topic of low self-esteem was raised. Tibetans do not have words in their language for low self-esteem, nor for guilt. So Westerners' problems with these feelings are not readily comprehensible to them. And it's kind of outrageous, right, that they don't have these words. And I don't know if that's true across the board in all Asian cultures, but in Tibet, this is not how they think of things. They don't have this denigration of themselves because they hold themselves to have, we're going to talk about this concept when we talk about the opposite side of it, Buddha nature, have kind of within themselves the makings of what will become this fully enlightened being, this Sangye, fully removing everything that is negative, advancing everything that is positive. So they see themselves in a very different light. And of course, guilt. We talk about this often in the teachings about how in the West, this is kind of a creation of our own minds. It's not something that is universal. It's something that we have put on ourselves and perhaps inherited to some degree from other spiritual traditions, but also from our culture. It's very much about feeling bad about ourselves. And then that feeds our low self-esteem. Anyway, back to the story. She says, His Holiness had difficulty understanding how someone could not like himself or herself. He looked around the room of educated, successful people and asked, "Who feels low self-esteem?" Everyone looked at each other and replied, "We all do." His Holiness was shocked. And he went on to discuss with them, the causes of this feeling and so on, which, to some degree can be attributed to our orientation in the West around everything needing to be perfect. A lot of people from a very young age grow up with this idea of needing to be perfect, needing to have straight A's, needing to have all the things that make it seem like they're doing a good job. And if they fail even to the slightest from that, then they beat themselves up, right? So again, this can seep into our spiritual practice, right? Where suddenly we're treating ourselves in terms of our spiritual practice, with the same sort of mentality, kind of again beating ourselves up because we're not there yet, because we aren't succeeding in the way that we ideally would like to. So again, this is quite prevalent in our culture, and often when His Holiness gets together with many of these behavioral psychologists, and neurobiologists, and all sorts of people from different disciplines, invariably this comes up because this is something is pretty. It's an epidemic in our culture, certainly. We go on to the fourth one, and continuing with these things that, in my estimation, are feeding into the problem that we have around the spiritual superego. Confusion, particularly about the Mahayana path in regard to altruism and the nature of compassion. This is a path that can be very enticing for people because the ideals are so lofty. As I was saying earlier, this bodhisattva ideal, the being who dedicates themselves to selfless service to other beings, who moves along this path of trying to uh, achieve the greatest possible goal of Buddhahood. I mean, it's really very, I can kind of romanticize it to some degree and think that, yeah, that's what I want to do. But sometimes when we sign up for that, we have this mistaken idea that that means then that we're involved in torturing ourselves, in beating ourselves up, in doing all kinds of things that kind of sacrifice our own welfare for the welfare of other beings. That's really not the nature of our path, as I'll go into in discussing the opposite to this shortly. I know even some of our teachers, there was one time I was very inspired by this teaching, but at the same time, it didn't really make me feel that good about myself. Lama Zopa Rinpoche, our spiritual director who passed away 2 years ago, he was teaching in Italy at a wonderful retreat in 2004 at the end of the program that I was involved in over there. And he made this statement, and it's in two parts. The first part is he said, "We need to abandon the happiness that leads to suffering." Of course, that's a basic Buddhist teaching, that we are caught up in the happiness of this material world and craving for all these things, and it only creates more suffering for us, right? They use the analogy of like honey on a razor blade, that it's delightful to lick it at first, but you're going to get cut in the end, right? So there is that kind of nature of the existence we're involved in as being unsatisfactory, and that's basic Buddhist teaching. So we have to abandon the happiness that leads to suffering. And then he went on to say, and we have to adopt the suffering that leads to happiness. It's like, whoa, what are you talking about here? The idea is that the spiritual path does entail a lot of suffering, does entail a lot of hard work. It is difficult to change our minds. This is a real challenge. When you hear sentences like that, it's we have to be willing to go to the suffering that's going to lead to happiness. Well, we know that it will lead to happiness. We have some confidence in that, perhaps. But we tend to think from those things that it means that we're just going to self-flagellate. And we're going to treat ourselves really poorly, and it's going to be miserable. And we're going to be. That's not what the path is supposed to be about at all. While yes, it is going to be difficult. You do have to do the hard work. You do have to actually, get on the cushion and do the meditation that you need to do. Nonetheless, it's meant to be a joyous path. So when we talk about the Mahayana path, it's that idea first that it needs to be something that we do with great joy and enthusiasm. It's not something that's like, oh, agony. I need to, do all this stuff that's going to be just torture for me. But moreover, it means also then holding this view of compassion for ourselves. So when I talk about this in terms of the antidotes to this shortly, I'm going to bring up some teachings from Kristen Neff, who's an expert in self-compassion. She's done a lot of research on this. Perhaps some of you have read her book on self-compassion, but she's really kind of got to the heart of what it means to be compassionate to ourselves, which is really one of the main things I want to cover today, because that's an important part of our practice. So again, the Mahayana path is an inspiring one, and it can be seen sometimes as challenging, difficult, entails a bit of suffering, hardship, but nonetheless, it can be very joyous. So don't let that become a cause for treating yourself poorly, for beating yourself up. Rather, again, we're going to look at the flip side of this in terms of self-compassion. The last thing that I think really does feed into some of our difficulties at times is the tendency we have to judge and compare ourselves and others, thus making the spiritual path into a competition. It's not a competition. We do look at others often and think, oh my gosh, they've been practicing the Dharma as long as I have. They arrived around the same time I did, and yet they seem to be doing so much better than I am. I even found a little cartoon that demonstrates this. I think this one's hilarious. We have this tendency to think that other people's spiritual journey is like this nice little trek up a hill, and ours is like, drowning in water and going all over the place and never getting anywhere. So, so that's probably not true. I think everyone has a path that's probably closer to the bottom of this. And I'm going to talk about again some of the antidotes to that thinking. But this judging and comparing mind is very much a part of our culture too. And I don't know, again, I'm not as well versed in the Eastern cultures, but I don't think it's as prevalent there, because there is this tendency of just being content with where you are and not thinking that you always have to be comparing yourself to others and thinking, oh my gosh, their knowledge is so much greater and I've been studying as much as them. Well, what am I missing? What am I lacking? And then we can beat ourselves up because we're not on the same level as those that we consider to be our peers. So these are things that I think we can perhaps, maybe hopefully each of you in these 5 that I've gone through had something in there that you're identifying with and go, yeah, that's part of me creating some of my own spiritual superego, my tendency to treat myself poorly on this spiritual path. So let's talk about what the sort of antidote to all of this is in general. I found some couple of passages that I think are quite useful. The alternative to the spiritual superego can be described in a couple of ways. One is by Rob Priest, who's also a psychologist who's been studying in our tradition for quite some time. He wrote a book that I really like called The Wisdom of Imperfection. We often talk about the perfection of wisdom. This is the wisdom of imperfection. And he says we need a deep-rooted compassion for ourselves in order to allow our fallibility and vulnerability on the path. And this is the main topic that I'm going to be dealing with again today, as I mentioned a short while ago, is this compassion for ourselves. How do we treat ourselves in the ideal way so that we allow the space for us to make errors, for us to not succeed at times, for us to not have it all feel warm and fuzzy, every moment, but to be okay with that, to treat ourselves well in the space of perhaps, again, not living up to these bodhisattva ideals or Mahayana ideals. And then the term that I think really kind of hits the nail on the head in regard to describing this, I saw in a book by Cheryl Huber. She's a Zen practitioner, called Making a Change for Good. Compassionate self-discipline is the term that she used, and I like this. It's simply allowing the intelligence and generosity that is your authentic nature to guide you in every moment. We often talk about that, about how part of the path and working with our teachers and so on is to help awaken, if you will, that inner guide, that inner intelligence and generosity that is really our true nature. But this idea of compassionate self-discipline, what I like about it is it includes compassionate, which of course is the key word we're going to be looking at today, self-compassion, treating ourselves gently, kindly. But nonetheless, it includes that very tough word, self-discipline. One of the things that we don't want to do is to become kind of blind to the deficiencies that we do have, the work that we need to do. There's always additional work to do, always things that we need to develop. And that is part of the path. So self-discipline is entailed. You can't get to enlightenment without some form of self-discipline. Maybe here I'll share this story that was really quite touching for me. In 1997, went to teachings with His Holiness the Dalai Lama at the UCLA auditorium. And in the course of these teachings, as he normally does, he takes questions from the audience. And one question that he got at the end of one teaching, I think it was at the end of one teaching, it said, "Your Holiness, what is the quickest, fastest way to become enlightened?" Right? You know, sound familiar? We always want that kind of quick, that's what I mentioned earlier, is kind of one of the tendencies we have. We want it right now. And His Holiness started speaking in Tibetan, and then he stopped and he actually started to cry. And you could hear a pin drop in this huge auditorium. It was just really quite profound. And then he decided not to speak in the Tibetan. He actually went to English, and he said, you know, this is our tendency, right? To think quickest, fastest, and so on. And he shared this story about Milarepa. Milarepa, many of you know, is the great Tibetan saint in the Kagyu tradition of Tibetan Buddhism. And he was preparing to leave this world. He knew that his time was coming. And so he told some of his disciples that he was going to give them a special teaching, the next day. And of course, they got all excited about, oh, what's this special teaching? What is this thing? He's going to give us the secret, the real mojo that's going to get me enlightened as quickly as possible, right? And so the next morning, they all show up with this anticipation. And Milarepa simply is sitting in front of them, and he stands up, turns around, and he lifts his robe to show his backside that is incredibly calloused from all of his sitting. That's the teaching. And His Holiness was recounting this teaching to the audience there, and we just were, really blown away by it, because he was like, it takes hard work. You cannot get there without some form of discipline, without actually doing the work. So again, he was saying it in a compassionate tone. Maybe it doesn't sound as compassionate the way I'm sharing it, but was really wanting us not to always think, quickest, fastest. And at the very end of that talk, he goes, it's important that you think long term, really think long term. And of course, in Buddhism, we don't have to do it all in this life, right? Because there are lifetimes stretching out in front of us. We have to tend to making sure that we can continue the path in our future lives, but we do everything that we can, to kind of take charge of our practice in this life, but to do it once more in a very compassionate way, but recognize that self-discipline is part of it. So this term, compassionate self-discipline, is a really nice way to think about what we need to be engaged in, as opposed to that spiritual superego that's beating ourselves up and, calling ourselves out on every deficiency that we have. Instead, I'm just going to compassionately tend to my spiritual development. Each day, do what I can. Even if it feels like some days it's, 2 steps forward, 3 steps back, or 1 step forward, 3 steps back. That's okay. That's the nature of a spiritual path. It takes a long time to change our minds. So that's kind of the label I'm putting on this in terms of how we're going to counter each of those 5 points that I went through, is to work with this moving towards a more compassionate self-discipline, where as we tend to ourselves, that kind of intelligence and generosity that is our authentic nature speaks more to us. It actually will have a louder voice than the spiritual superego. We'll actually know how to treat ourselves well. But nonetheless, we do have to take some steps to get there. This isn't something we can just flip a switch and suddenly we have this compassionate self-discipline. So what steps do we take to address the situation? How can we become our own best friend on the spiritual path? Well, let's look at each of these 5 things that I delineated, and talk a little bit about how we can address those. The first one, once more, was misunderstanding the nature of a spiritual path and what we're really undertaking in our practice. Once more, that removing the negative, advancing, cultivating the positive. First, be clear about what we're actually trying to do in our practice. Once more, to recognize that we are trying to tend to the sort of gardens of our mind. I often use this analogy because I think it's really useful. If we think of our minds as like a bed of soil, well, we haven't been tending our minds so well. Hate to say it. Since beginningless time, we perhaps weren't really working with our minds so much as with working with the external world. That's, again, the antithesis of Buddhist practice. It's not about changing everything on the outside. It's about tending to what's on the inside. Well, in the process of this, we've gotten a lot of weeds in our garden and a lot of rocks and things that are not useful to grow a beautiful flower garden that is sort of, again, our birthright. Our minds have the potential to become that. Of course, right now, they're covered with weeds and not so, pretty to look at. Again, we have to tend to that gradually removing all of those negative tendencies and then creating all the optimal conditions for everything that is positive to grow, which means, of course, in terms of the bed of soil, making sure that there's lots of rich nutrients in the soil, that there's enough water and sunlight and everything, so that you get this beautiful flower garden. Well, we need to create those conditions for ourselves as well. That's what the spiritual path is all about. So it's going to take some time, once more, given the fact that we have been involved in all of this since beginningless time. Here, I'll share a little story about somebody who I worked with, um, who was trying to work with his anger issues. I may have shared this when I talked about anger in the previous workshop that I did. But nonetheless, he was sharing with me a story that is from here in Santa Fe when he was going, I think he was leaving community college. So many of you have been out there, and there's like a couple of roundabouts there now. Those roundabouts, I think a lot of people get a bit confused at them, but he came up to his, and there was a car that was starting to come around, and he probably had enough room to get in front of the car, but he decided to be polite and patient and let the car go past. Well, as he's practicing being patient and not, getting upset at anything, the person behind him didn't like this at all. And kind of lays on the horn and starts yelling out the window, what are you doing? Get going, get going. And so he sees him in his rearview mirror, and he goes like this with his tendency to extend his middle finger to the person behind him, but he stops with just his fist up. And I was like, congratulations, that's great. You stopped. You didn't extend your middle finger. And that's the thing, is it does take some time to change our minds. We have that tendency, once more, to always go to our more immediate reaction, which is usually some delusion, our anger, our jealousy, our greed, whatever, all of these different delusions that are more habitual for us. So it's going to take time. So I was like, with this guy, it was like, this is great. You're making some progress. You're actually doing the work you need to do. And it's evident because you would have stuck up your middle finger if you hadn't, right? Now, maybe the next time he actually does flip the person off. Well, that's okay once more, too, because at least he's conscious of it and working on it. As I said many times, sometimes you don't even have the awareness that you did something that was more habitual and not something you want to do until after the fact. That's okay, too. At least you're aware of it then. How long have we gone on in our lives not even caring what we do? We just flip everybody off and do everything we want to do and don't even think about it. Well, now at least we're thinking about it. So again, this first kind of antidote is to recognize that you do have this kind of delay in putting the teachings into effect. It takes a while to cultivate the path. Another thought related to it is that certainly, while given that Buddhism is something we ideally want to practice kind of 24/7, we want to be able to be in the world living by these ideals, we also need to tend to ourselves in terms of relinquishing the practice when we need to. I do think that, we tend to be pretty hard on ourselves in that regard too, thinking that every moment I have to spend engaged in some sort of practice. Well, that's not, a way to necessarily get there. The second point on the screen there, take time to recharge and relinquish the work when needed. And I added these three words the last time I taught on this because I'd been with one of my teacher friends in California, and she was telling me how she's realized how she doesn't have enough play in her life in terms of giving yourself a chance to play, to just kind of experience more kind of basic joy. We do get joy from our practice too. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that this path is all like, humdrum and difficulty and whatever. It's really meant to be a joyous path. But sometimes we need to set the work aside and really take care of ourselves in terms of play or things that reinforce kind of an enthusiasm for our practice. One of the things that's taught in the Mahayana path is this whole practice of what we call joyous effort or enthusiastic effort. You do have to have, once more, that self-discipline, putting effort into the path. But it needs to have an element of joy. And the analogy that they use often is that your joy in your practice should be like the joy of a child playing in the sandbox or something, or whatever type of play they engage in. It's really quite amazing if you've been around young kids and you see them playing by themselves, and they just are able to entertain themselves with such delight for like hours. So again, bring some of that into your practice, but also recognize that you need to recharge at times as well. That's another power that we need in maintaining our practice joyful, is to make sure that we relinquish, that we set aside the work at times. And we recognize that, yes, it's nice as an ideal to be practicing 24/7, but it's unrealistic for us at this time in our practice. Most of us don't have that ability to maintain that kind of mindfulness and effort and what have you during our day. So that is an important thing to keep in mind in terms of understanding the nature of the path, also requiring that we have some time when we set the work aside. And then the phrase I mentioned earlier, though spiritual work is hard, we simply, don't have to be hard on ourselves. And we're all works in progress. I sometimes use this phrase. I don't know. I've never heard any of my teachers say it, so I hope I'm not saying something that's totally out of the scope of teachings. But at some level, we're all doing the best that we can. And say that again. At some level, we're all doing the best as we can. That applies to all of us in the room, everyone listening to these teachings, in terms of your own spiritual practice. If you could do better, you would do better, right? So the footnote to this, we're all doing the best that we can. The footnote is, and with effort, we can do better. With discipline, we can do better. With dedicating ourselves to practice, we can do better because we're not fixed in some sort of static mode that never changes. We are on some general upward trajectory, but we're having to be attentive to that it does take some time. It does take some concerted effort. But essentially, we are doing the best that we can in the moment. So don't beat yourself up. There's no need for that. If you found that, suddenly you're in the grocery store and somebody accosts you about something that they didn't like that you did or something, and you get angry and upset, well, then don't beat yourself up. Recognize you did the best that you can, and you can do better by doing the continual work, continuing to look at how our minds have tendencies to see things in a particular way and trying to address our anger or other issues. So there's no need to be hard on yourself. It is a hard path. It is a difficult path, but don't beat yourself up. That's just ridiculous. The second thing, tending to hone in on the negative and not appreciate the positive. First of all, the one point I want to emphasize, which is a practice that we do have as part also of our enthusiasm for our path, is to regularly engage in the practice of rejoicing, bringing in joy and celebration. Yeah, we're really good at looking at the negative, at finding our own faults, picking ourselves apart, beating ourselves up. But how often do we take time to actually sit down and acknowledge the good qualities that we have? I had you do that as part of the motivation today. Maybe I'll see if anyone wanted to share anything from that brief reflection. What was it like to begin by thinking about the things that you do that are notable, that are worth being acknowledged, that you have made some progress in regard to your spiritual path? Does anyone want to share anything on that? We've got a microphone here in the Kampa, by the way, if you do want to share anything. Um, Nobody wants to share. Do we have anybody online who would like to share? Well, I think this is something, once more, that even in our culture we don't tend to do quite as much. I mean, maybe when we're young, if we did have a good family environment and maybe good teachers at school and everything, they would kind of point out the good things that we're doing. It's really good. You're making a lot of progress in your study of this and study of that, whatever. But as we get into outside of school and everything, if we did have those influences during school, well, then how do we get that in our daily life? We might get it a little bit at work by people acknowledging how we contributed in certain ways. How often do we do that for ourselves? Really look at it ourselves and say, yes, I've done a good job. I can rejoice in the things that I have developed, the ways that I have changed my mind. Again, for my friend, who I was working with, who was put his fist up, rejoice in that. Congratulations. That's wonderful that all you did was put a fist up, didn't extend that middle finger. That's wonderful, right? So again, rejoicing is a practice that we need to do pretty regularly. Most of you are involved in some level of doing purification practice during your day. I'm not going to go into that. That's a way we kind of tidy up the things that we haven't done so well by addressing them in a kind of compassionate way. But then to rejoice afterwards, to kind of say, I'm not just going to focus on the ways that I stepped in it today. I'm going to focus on also the wonderful things that I did, the ways that I was kind to this person who was on the street, or the way that I was patient with the person at work who annoys me, or whatever the case might be. Give yourself an opportunity to rejoice in that. Rejoicing is a wonderful practice. It makes us feel a bit lighter, take a little more delight, and celebrate the things that we have done. I'm going to share a little passage from Pema Chodron. Many of you have heard of her, if not all of you. A book that she wrote called The Places That Scare You. Every one of her books is wonderful, but this one I was really taken by this passage, and I end up sharing it. There's like 3 slides that go into this. And she starts off with this wonderful slogan that comes from the Lojong teachings, the mind training teachings of Tibetan Buddhism. Always maintain only a joyful mind. She says that's one of the main mind training slogans. This might sound like an impossible aspiration. As one man said to me, always is a very long time. How do we always maintain only a joyful mind? Yet, she says, as we train in unblocking our basic goodness, we find that every moment contains the free flowing openness and warmth that characterize unlimited joy. This is the path we take in cultivating joy. Learning not to armor our basic goodness, learning to appreciate what we have. So again, that's the idea behind it, is we are trying to make sure that we create the optimal qualities for us to continue to develop that inner goodness, that basic goodness, that Buddha nature. Learning to appreciate what we have accomplished and what we have, in our lives. And then this is the phrase that really got me. Most of the time, though, we don't do this. Rather than appreciate where we are, we continually struggle and nurture our dissatisfaction. It's like trying to get the flowers to grow by pouring cement on the garden. So using my analogy of our minds being like a bed of soil, well, this is what we're doing, is we're not allowing the flowers to grow. We're pouring cement on the garden every time that we don't bring kind of joy into our practice, that we instead bring some kind of self-judgment, self-criticism, what have you. So the very first antidote in terms of this imbalance of tending to the negative way more than we do the positive is to really appreciate the positive. Don't be throwing cement on the garden. Throw the delightful water and nutrients that help the flowers to grow. That's the joyous spirit that we want to bring to our practice. Another couple points that I want to make in regard to the second one about overcoming the negative. When addressing our faults, do so in a more balanced way, acknowledging our qualities and progress as well. It sounds a bit like the rejoicing, but it's a little bit more refined, because we're trying to say, okay, if I'm really working on eliminating my anger, reducing my anger, well, then we have to be kind to ourselves by acknowledging what steps we've already made. What work we have done that has made us more capable at doing that job. We all are making progress here and there. We often don't see it, though. I know sometimes people say, well, think about all the progress you made since you first entered the Buddhist path, since you first encountered these teachings and started to work on your mind. But oftentimes we're blind to that too. And we don't really see the ways that we've changed. But we've all changed, without a doubt. I mean, I can certainly say that I've changed over the 30 plus years that I've been practicing Buddhism. Now, have I changed to where I don't have any moments of anger anymore? Well, not to that degree, but I'm moving in that direction, moving in that trajectory. And that's great. When we do the work and trying to focus on what we need to address, again, through that self-discipline, we do it once more in a compassionate, kind way by rejoicing in the things that we have accomplished, acknowledging the ways that we've made progress on our spiritual path. The last point that I want to emphasize here, because a lot of times we're really negative on ourselves because of our failings, because of the things that, again, we thought we'd be better at being patient with, our siblings when we were at Thanksgiving dinner or something, and we ended up getting entangled in it again. We stepped in it again. So remember that our failings are opportunities to learn and grow. If you never met with those people who do push your buttons, who you do need to be more patient with, for example, well, then you never would learn the opportunity to grow that you need to take from that you need to say, okay, I have to do a little bit more work, because I found that suddenly I was reacting with anger rather than being patient and kind and tolerant. So again, everything that we encounter is kind of grist for the mill. We use this phrase often. No matter what we are encountering, it's an opportunity for us to deepen our understanding and deepen our practice, and especially our failings. If we don't have those failings, how would we learn? We need to have those. They are definitely a part of our spiritual path. So don't think that you're going to be perfect. Don't think that just because you have gone to a number of Buddhist teachings or sat on the cushion for so many hours that suddenly you've got complete control over your mind. Maybe here I'll share the wonderful saying that Suzuki Roshi said, apparently. I think this was shared by Louis Richmond in a book that he wrote, Zen student. He said that Suzuki Roshi had an audience of people like this, and he told them, first of all, he said, "You're all perfect just as you are." A bit like what I was saying earlier about we're all doing the best that we can. It's kind of acknowledging, you're all perfect just as you are. Kind of feel, oh, how nice. And then he said, but you could use a little work. you know so we can all use a little work. We might be perfect in some sense in terms of we're at this particular moment, we are exactly where we are, but you can use a little work. So again, kind of that compassionate self-discipline, again, to treat ourselves well, to kind of focus on that more joyful side of it, and then to acknowledge, yes, and we still do need to do a little bit of work, and we'll all get there eventually. Once more, yeah, as we're going to see, it's not, a competition. So any failings that we have, opportunity to learn. Don't look at them as failings. Look at them actually in that light. The third one, the tough one, right? The low self-esteem that's so endemic in our culture, self-contempt, self-loathing. First of all, be conscious of the pure nature of the mind and the potential that we all possess. I alluded to this earlier. This is what we call, again, Buddha nature. What does Buddha nature mean? Buddha nature doesn't mean that you're like a fully evolved Buddha inside here somewhere. I hear that sometimes in Buddhist teachings, and I'm not sure what to make out of that, because it sounds like, that we're already there. And that's a bit too much of that first statement from Suzuki Roshi, that we're perfect just as we are, not taking into consideration that we all still could use a little work. We all still need to do the work to be able to accomplish the final result. We have what's called sort of the seed or potential of Buddhahood, which means that we have a mind. Any being that has a mind, sentient being, in Tibetan the word for sentient being is semchen. Semchen means mind possessor. If you possess a mind, which is everybody listening to these teachings, you have Buddha nature. You have a mind that can be developed into the state of a Buddha. Venerable Rabina, who's coming here next month, very excited about her return. Wonderful teacher, my first teacher in this tradition. Anyway, she uses the example of an acorn, right? If you had an acorn, you could use it for a lot of things, and kids use them for a lot of things, right? They might shoot them with a slingshot or something horrible thing to do with them. Or they might actually get creative and paint on them. They look like little heads, right? You could paint little faces on them and paint the little acorn cap a different color or something. You can do all kinds of creative things with acorns. But what's the potential of an acorn? To become an oak tree, right? So we've done a lot of things with our minds, and various things to entertain our minds and engross our minds in this and that. But that's not the real nature of our mind, simply to experience the sensory pleasures of this world. The nature and potential of your mind is to develop it into the state of Buddhahood. Because our minds essentially are clear and pure. What is polluting our minds is only there, they use this wonderful word, adventitiously. Adventitiously means that the counterforce to it has simply not been brought to bear. So it's still there. All the impurities in our mind that we want to get rid of, all the anger and jealousy and greed and ignorance and spite and all of these various things that we identify in our Buddhist psychology, all of that is there because we haven't created the antidote to it. It's not in the actual nature of your mind. Another analogy that's used for this is a glass of clear water, right? We can go to the tap and get a glass of water, and we can see the natural clarity of the water. But if I go out into the courtyard there and find some dirt and spoon the dirt into the water and mix it up, then it becomes opaque. Right? You don't have the clarity of the water being evident. That's our minds right now. We've got a lot of dirt in our minds, a lot of pollution in our minds that has been there since beginningless time that we need to purify and get rid of. The fundamental nature of our minds is clarity, is purity. None of that pollutes our minds in an inherent way. It is only there again because we haven't purified our minds in that. Once we do the work and remove all of that sediment, If you do that with water, you remove all the sediment, the clarity of the water returns. When we remove the sediment of our minds, the pollution in our minds, then the clarity of our minds shines forth. That's your Buddha nature. That's what it means to become a Buddha. Removing all of that, and again, advancing all the positive qualities that are resonant with that fundamental nature of your mind. So, again, that's what we are focusing on. That's the main work that we need to do. And to recall that that is totally defeated by any thoughts of low self esteem or self hatred because you have that natural purity. And now, when I grew up in the Roman Catholic tradition, I didn't get this message, and maybe I was sick the day when they said that you have a natural goodness or basic goodness within you, because it does seem that many Christian teachings and many, other teachings do allude to this. But I always got the impression that I was kind of faulty from the very beginning. Like I was stained. If you grew up Catholic, you got this idea of original sin that we are all sort of stained by, tainted by. That's not a very healthy way to look at oneself, right? But we've also been fed that message, not just from other spiritual traditions, perhaps, but also by our culture that really, again, focuses on what we're deficient of, what we lack. All of that lack ends up to feelings of self-hatred. So acknowledge that you have this precious jewel of Buddha nature at the core of your being. It's not like it's, again, I'm pointing here, it's not like it's located here. This is where Tibetans always point to their mind, because the deepest, most subtle state of mind is said to reside in your heart chakra. Anyway, but the idea is that, this is what we have as our birthright. Every one of us has Buddha nature. How wonderful. That's true for ourselves in terms of the work we're doing here on looking at this, but it's also true for every being that we see, whether it be a mosquito or a rat or whatever the case might be. All of these beings, because they have a mind, they have Buddha nature. They may not be able to do much with that in this lifetime because they don't have the ability to develop their minds, but we have that and can do something with it. Also recall that our situation is always workable. Now, this is some of the teachings that I went into in the course I did earlier this year it was in February, on mind training. Essentially, what we are trying to do is to work with anything that we encounter. Everything is workable. So there's no need to beat ourselves up, because essentially we can just simply roll up our sleeves and continue to do the work. And the work is always going to be there to do. So we don't have to, again, make these immediate progress in regard to everything. And there's no need to have low self-esteem when that's not happening. We just continue to work with each situation. If good things are arising, don't get too caught up in it and work with that in a positive way. If bad things are happening, well, then don't get too bent out of shape by it and work with it in a more positive way. Our situation is always working. So again, don't fall into this pattern of low self-esteem or self-hatred, because we're all these works in progress, continuing to just roll up our sleeves and do the work. The third, examine the sources of self-deprecating thoughts. That we do have, once more, kind of things within us that have become the sources of these, the causes for those to be in our minds. Let me look at my notes here, what else I wanted to share on this. The sources, of course, when we start talking about them, we often talk about these two kind of demons, the two main minds that we're trying to overcome. One of them is the mind of self-cherishing, the tendency that we have to be quite focused on ourselves. Going back to that meeting that His Holiness had with these Westerners where they were talking about low self-esteem, it was interesting when His Holiness continued talking about this, he actually said that he feels that when we are doing that in the West, or it's not so much in Tibet and what have you, when we're doing that, we're actually very self-centered. It's the same mind that tends to treat ourselves as being superior that is also treating ourselves as being inferior. It's kind of interesting. We wrap ourselves around this strong feeling of me, myself, and I, and everything that I need and my own self-importance. And we can go to those two extremes of thinking that we're above everybody else with a very prideful mind, or we're below everybody else with a low self-esteem. They're the same root, the same source. That's one of the main minds we want to overcome, because that's the mind that keeps us totally preoccupied with our own stuff. It doesn't allow us to extend ourselves to others. So we have to see that when we have this low self-esteem coming into play, it's arising from that root of the tendency that we have to be very self-centered, something that we need to kind of move away from, to recognize that it's not all about us. Things may look like they're all about us, but essentially we're just one person, one being in the sea of beings. We need to kind of break out of some of those patterns. The other one that I just want to mention real quickly, this kind of deeper root, which is something I won't have time to go into so much today, is the self-grasping, the tendency to kind of reify this sense of a self right to from the very beginning, that we hold to as being really concretely here. And of course, the Buddha says, if we examine, investigate, we find that no such self or I exists. And of course, that can be a pretty major antidote to undermining any sort of self loathing when we come to see the self that we are tending to be focused on at that point doesn't really have any existence. So I'm going to skip over that to some degree because, once more, that's a much more complex teaching. The last thing I want to touch on in regard to low self-esteem is something that John Wellwood brings up in his book, which is this term that you perhaps have heard called spiritual bypassing. This is something, again, that when we do have things that we are perhaps focused on in regard to our own negativities and so on, that we might need to do some constructive work to deal with those. And sometimes that can be done in Western psychology as much as in Buddhist psychology. This is how he defines this concept of spiritual bypassing. It's using spiritual ideas and practices to sidestep personal, emotional, unfinished business, to shore up a shaky sense of self, or to belittle basic needs, feelings, and developmental tasks, all in the name of enlightenment. It's kind of this tendency that we have to skirt over things that are kind of unpleasant that we don't really want to look at in regard to uh, kind of who we are at this time, with the foibles, the faults that we might see. The mind of low self-esteem sees those and goes to this place of kind of despair and doesn't really feel so good about all of that. But those are all, again, things that we can work with. Spiritual bypassing is where we think, oh, I'm just going to subscribe to this bodhisattva ideal and this wonderful way of being, this great spiritual goal that I'm trying to achieve, and totally neglect all this other stuff. Well, guess what? This is grist for the mill, too. Everything, once more, is very workable. And we need to work with things. Otherwise, they will come back to haunt us later on in our spiritual development. I remember when I first approached the spiritual path, I mean, I really was taken by that kind of bodhisattva ideal, this amazing compassion of these beings to continue to be involved in the world and to do everything they can to benefit others. It's kind of really spoke to me. But I realized that unless I started doing work on myself and dealing with my own stuff, there's no way to get there. And that's, of course, how the entire path is set up, right? You have to work on your own stuff first. But we all have to do that work before we can really feel qualified to be able to benefit others. So recognize that, again, this spiritual bypassing, this tendency to kind of skirt over these things, isn't really healthy. And moreover, it's just impossible because we have to deal with those issues. We have to confront those things. Those are the things from which our spiritual development will be made. That's why most of you know, but in the way that we organize the Buddhist spiritual teachings in this tradition is what's called the Lam Rim, the stages of the path. There are 3 levels of it. And the first 2 levels are focusing on yourself, to do the work on yourself. The first one, to do kind of a cognizance of we're here in this wonderful human life. This life's going to come to an end, and we need to be concerned about what comes after this life. Well, that's tending to our own situation very skillfully, saying, I'm going to care enough about myself to create the causes in this life, to have a continuity of good rebirth so I can be in a similar situation in the future. The second level is where we look at the bigger picture. And I've been involved in going from life to life since beginningless time again. I've been doing this ad nauseum, and it's time for me to get out of this. That's where we develop a genuine concern for our own freedom, to want to attain the state of nirvana, the peace that we all have, again, the birthright to achieve. The third scope is where you actually universalize that and you say, and that's true for every other being. So I would be very selfish and just, solely concerned about my own welfare if I were to practice those first 2 only. I need to go on to this third level where I generate bodhicitta, the wish to benefit all beings, and so on. So once more, the whole path entails tending to our own stuff. So spiritual bypassing, in particularly in this path, isn't going to get you anywhere if you don't look at the stuff that is in your life that you need to deal with, things, patterns that you've created, and so on. And once more, a lot of that can be dealt with in very healthy ways through Western psychology. Buddhist psychology obviously takes things to another degree, but nonetheless, take care of the things that are patterns that you have from your own life. Even when we get to the practice of Tantra, which is an extension of that third level, I remember in one of Rob Priest's book, he says you have to have a healthy ego to be able to kind of dismantle it in the Tantric techniques. We have to feel kind of resolved around a lot of our stuff. We have to actually do the work with those things. So this is an important part of it. When we see that we're falling into the pattern of low self-esteem, recognize that we might be engaged to some degree in spiritual bypassing and not really taking advantage of those things. So the final word on this from John Wellwood: when people use spiritual practice to try to compensate for low self-esteem, social alienation, or emotional problems, they corrupt the true nature of spiritual practice. It's not meant to be a kind of panacea. It's not meant to be something that we just apply in a way to smooth over all of the stuff that we have from our past that we do need to deal with. I'm sorry, one more passage. Spiritual bypassing is a strong temptation in times like ours, when achieving what were once ordinary developmental landmarks, earning a livelihood through dignified, meaningful work, raising a family, sustaining a long-term intimate relationship, belonging to a larger social community, all of those have become increasingly difficult and elusive. We are living in challenging times. So, yet when people use spirituality to cover up their difficulties with functioning in the modern world, their spiritual practice remains in a separate compartment, unintegrated with the rest of their life. And that's the whole point. Spiritual practice is not something we just do on our cushion. It's something you do as you're out in the world, working with these teachings and changing your mind and resolving the issues that you have in the world. Right? It's not meant to be done in isolation. We have to have that kind of converging of our spiritual practice into all elements of our relation, our work, whatever the case might be, our family, social lives. All of these are a dimension of our spiritual practice. Okay, carrying on. Let's move on to the fourth one, the confusion about the Mahayana path. Again, that we think being altruistic and compassion means not tending to ourselves, but rather being focused on the needs of others. Remember that, of course, compassion in the Mahayana includes self-compassion. That's what I just pointed out in regard to the three levels of the path. You have to have a willingness to look at your own situation first before you can apply that understanding to others. Practicing self-compassion, therefore, is essential in addressing all of these sources of the spiritual superego, because if we treat ourselves more compassionately, then most of these patterns tend to fall away. I was touched by this phrase that I saw at the Garden of a Thousand Buddhas. This is it says it's from the Buddha. I've not located the particular sutra, discourse where he gave this teaching, but he says, you can search throughout the entire universe for someone who is more deserving of your love and affection than you are yourself, and that person is not to be found anywhere. You yourself, as much as anybody in the entire universe, deserve your love and affection. Now, this isn't meant to be kind of reinforcing our self-centeredness. This is meant to be really acknowledging that we also are objects of our love, affection, compassion. Don't think that having that means having that solely for beings other than yourself. It starts with yourself. So I'm going to share just a few passages here and highlight a few points from Kristen Neff, her work on self-compassion, because I think it's really important that you come away at least with some tools around that. Compassion then involves the recognition and clear seeing of suffering. It also involves feeling of kindness for people who are suffering, so that the desire to help, to ameliorate suffering, emerges. Finally, compassion involves recognizing our shared human condition, flawed and fragile as it is. So that's compassion in general. But what about compassion for ourselves? By definition, it involves the same qualities. It requires that we stop to recognize our own suffering. We can't be moved by our own pain if we don't even acknowledge that it exists in the first place. That's the first step, right? Is to acknowledge that it's hard for us sometimes. Even on the spiritual path, it's hard work. The suffering that leads to happiness, as Rinpoche said. So she goes through 3 points, and I think these are all worth emphasizing. As she's defined it, self-compassion entails three core components. First, it requires self-kindness, that we be gentle and understanding with ourselves rather than harshly critical and judgmental. So all of those ways that we talk to ourselves, I find it quite interesting. She says that if we looked at the language we use, that self-language and talking to ourselves, if we talk to our friends that way, we wouldn't have any friends. And it's really true, right? We tend to be really hard on ourselves and say, oh, you stupid idiot, what were you doing? If we said that to the people that we're with, like, Judith, you stupid idiot. I mean, Judith wouldn't want anything to do with me, right? She'd say, thanks a lot, Don. I'll find somebody who treats me better, right? Well, we can't do that with ourselves. We have to create somebody who treats us better. You create somebody who treats yourself better through self-compassion, through changing the language that you use towards yourself, being kind and compassionate towards yourself, recognizing, yes, it's tough. You're having a tough time, Don. Acknowledging that that's hard right now. Nothing wrong with that. It's not pampering ourselves. It's just being honest rather than, again, treating ourselves in the opposite way. So this is the first one, really important, self-kindness. Second, it requires that recognition of our common humanity, feeling connected with others in the experience of life, rather than feeling isolated and alienated by ourselves. Compassion for ourselves is a touchstone for our condition, the condition of all of humanity, and we could say even of all of existence, to go to beyond humanity to other forms of beings that also are sentient beings. But the idea is that we recognize that it is natural for us to have difficulty and to suffer, and for us to have challenges in our lives, and for us to have, not be able to make progress in our spiritual path or whatever the case might be. It's very important that we acknowledge that dimension of it. But third, it requires mindfulness, that we hold our experience in balanced awareness rather than ignoring our pain or exaggerating it. We must achieve and combine these three essential elements in order to be truly self-compassionate. I'm going to share with you, and I'll even send this along to Venerable Dundrup, the slides that I shared today. I'll put in a PDF file, and then also the practice. It's called a self-compassion break that Kristen Neff put together. And it entails those 3 points. It kind of reverses them to some degree. It starts with the mindfulness. And it says when you're taking a self-compassion break, this might be at a time when you're finding things really challenging. And it could be in regard to your spiritual practice, or could just be in regard to things that are going on in your life. The very first thing is to, with that mindfulness, acknowledge that what you are experiencing is a moment of suffering, is something challenging and hard for you. To be able to hold that awareness and to be mindful enough to see it for that, rather than just skirting over it. That might be a form of spiritual bypassing as well, just to kind of not want to look at our own kind of difficulties and challenges. Just to bring it into our awareness and say, this is a moment of suffering that I'm going through. The second one is that ability to connect it to the larger, suffering that is going on in our world. That this is also part of the experience of our shared humanity. That everyone has moments like that, moments of feeling, frustrated, feeling like they can't make any progress, feeling like they are continuing to step in it again and again and not do much to, improve their minds, whatever the case might be. That's the tendency that we all have, to experience the varieties of suffering as just part of being human. The third one is the kindness. And that involves actually, and she says you can even use a gesture like, holding yourself, kind of hugging yourself. But, I find it really useful to do this practice of just putting my hand at my heart and just feeling this kind of nurturing of myself and then saying kind things to myself. And that's the one thing that we once more do to change that language, that tendency that we have to not be so kind to ourselves, to treat ourselves really, really poorly. So you treat yourself with kindness at those times. You take a little self-compassion break whenever you need to. Maybe you just got into it at work with somebody who you have that pattern, and you feel frustrated that you weren't able to be more patient. And so you go and you disappear somewhere, maybe go back to, if you can go back to a cubicle or desk or somewhere where you can sit quietly, or maybe you go out to your car, or you go outside where there's nature or something, and you just do this self-compassion break. Acknowledge that it's tough, that this is a moment of suffering, that this is part of our shared humanity, so it doesn't feel so isolating, feels it's kind of a part of the universal condition. And then third, treat yourself with kindness. It's a really amazing practice. This is self-compassion is still, I think, pretty important in the world of Western psychology. They've been doing a lot of work around positive psychology, things that are more instrumental in helping to induce more positive states of mind in people, rather than continuing to focus in on the pathologies and what have you that Western psychology was built on. So again, just to review, self-kindness entails stopping the harsh criticism and self-judgment, seeing that they harm us, and then actively comforting ourselves. Again, that was the third step in the self-compassion break. I'll leave that in there. You can read that later. When we develop the habit of self-kindness, suffering becomes an opportunity to experience love and tenderness from within. No matter how difficult things get, we can always wrap our torn and tattered selves in our own soft embrace. Then secondly, the recognition of our common humanity. That means acknowledging interconnectedness, so we include awareness of others, not just ourselves at that time, so it doesn't become a pattern of self-centeredness. And then secondly, seeing the imperfection that we all deal with, along with the sense of inadequacy. But this is common. You're no different in that regard. Then third, the mindfulness, having clear seeing and a full acceptance of what's occurring in the present moment, facing up to reality. This is a moment of suffering. That was the first step in the self-compassion break. Responding compassionately and effectively rather than reacting in our more habitual harmful ways of, again, either neglecting our suffering or beating ourselves up because of the ways that we've been deficient and so on. So then she goes on to say, mindfulness is not some special esoteric practice we have to pull out of a magician's hat. We all are innately gifted with the ability to be aware of our own field of awareness. I'm going to pass over those. So these are the 3 points that she makes. I've already talked about them. They're in the slides. You can read them later if you're curious. I want to go on to the 5th one because we're running out of time. This tendency of kind of comparing ourselves to others. First of all, accept that you are where you are. That's a bit of that, you're perfect just the way you are kind of thing. That you have to be willing to accept that, yes, we're not Buddhas yet. We have Buddha nature, Buddha potential, but we're not there yet. Also see that judging yourself against others is not helpful, and return to a more present connection to the whole experience. And the last point, I think, is particularly important: cultivate an appreciation for other and ourselves, understanding that each of us will practice the path in our own way. So any kind of comparison or judgment in regard to ourselves and others isn't really meaningful, because we all practice in our own way. And every one of us, although the Buddhist path is set out with these 3 levels and these various meditations, what have you, we're all going to go about it in our own unique way. We're going to develop our own minds according to our own propensities and our own abilities. So don't think that I have to be the same as everyone else. And we got into this a bit, I have to admit, in the master's program. We were like a group of initially about 45 people all going through a set study of 7 years, 5 courses. And you tend to get into a lot of that judging and comparing and why are they doing so well, and I spend so much time studying, and why am I not getting the marks of other people, and what have you. But we all have different propensities, different abilities, so don't really get into that place. It's not fruitful. It doesn't really do anything except create more misery for ourselves, because that mind of judging is not one that is really beneficial or helpful for us. The last point I want to make before I open it up to questions is, finally, have fun. Be sure to use humor and lightness as you work with all this advice. I mean, look at our teachers. I mean, His Holiness the Dalai Lama, he's laughing constantly, right? It just really takes everything very lightly. There was one time I remember when he was teaching, and somebody caught him in some sort of an error or something. Maybe it was Thupten Jinpa, his translator, and kind of pointed out to him. And initially he couldn't see it. And then when he finally saw it, he was like, oh, just laughing away, because when we can see our own faults and laugh at them and be kind of light with ourselves, that's so much better. And to that end, I'm going to share a little cartoon. Please don't take offense of the 4-letter word in here, but this one I really liked when I saw it on Facebook. Anyway, I don't think this is an actual quote of the Buddha. I haven't found it in a sutra either, but just so you know, there is actually a website where it's called fake Buddha quotes. Yeah. And this is a monk who's devoted his life to kind of debunking all these quotes that are attributed to the Buddha and Facebook memes and what have you. So that one I don't think is a quote, but I think it's the spirit of what the Buddha taught, right? We need to chill a bit. We need to let some of this stuff go, recognize that, we need to be our best friend in regard to our spiritual practice. So, okay, take a breath. Let's see if there are any questions or comments in the Gompa or online. If you're online, again, I think it's already been put in the chat box, but make sure that you do just put up your icon and then we will call on you. A little hand up, raise hand.
Gen Don, T-Joy had some questions on spiritual bypassing before you brought up the topic. So I was wondering if T-Joy, do you have any more to ask, to add?
Hi, T-Joy.
Thank you so much for your teaching today. Can you hear me okay?
Now I can hear you, yes.
Oh, okay, yes. I was wondering, because in my opinion, I think this could be true, that spiritual bypassing is more common in the West and the Western mind, just from my experiences in different faiths. So I was asking about just practices and ways that could help the Western mind to ensure, because my other question was, how do we know sometimes if we are spiritual bypassing, if we're practicing truly from the heart or not? And then I reflected as you were speaking, and I put a response in the chat of a practice that I kind of do now of kind of honoring those experiences or negative feelings, because I think in our practices that's one of the hardest things, is to honor negative things, not judging ourselves for the negative things. And you kind of already talked about that, as far as taking that moment to really give that loving kindness and compassion to ourselves, what we're experiencing, how we're feeling, and then being able to then offer that to our other selves or other beings, and understanding we're all here learning. And also, no matter who we are, what titles we have, if we're robed or not robed. And so it sometimes is not easy for me, but that's kind of my practice right now, and kind of ensuring I am not spiritually bypassing. And I wanted to know if you had anything to add to that. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. Yeah, the sound in the Gompa here is not the best, so I wasn't able to pick up everything, but I'll add what I can in regard to that. I mean, I think in terms of spiritual bypassing, the biggest danger, of course, is that we are, not just skirting over things and leaving those things untended, but that there actually is something we can benefit from engaging in those things. So if we look at what's going on in terms of, patterns that we've had or things that we might have induced, I mean, I do work with some people sometimes, and they might attribute certain faults or defects that they have in their lives to things that happened earlier in their lives. That's a Western psychology kind of approach often, right? Where we kind of point to things and we say, oh, if I hadn't been abandoned when I was young, in terms of not feeling like I was as supported by my parents or whatever, then I would be this different person. But not really recognizing that there's something to be learned by looking at those abandonment issues or looking at whatever other issues that we might have. And so the idea is that to not deal with those things is going to be problematic, absolutely, because they will rear their ugly head in terms of patterns that cause us to not practice wholeheartedly, to not engage in things with the dedication and the ability to change our minds that we should be able to do, ideally, with using the Buddha's teachings. But moreover, they really do help us to look at kind of what is going on for us that we can kind of work with, make that, again, grist for the mill. What is it that we can actually be kind of attentive to? So in terms of any ways that we could make sure that we're not doing that, I mean, maybe it does take some ability for us to be honest with ourselves and investigate, well, what are the things that are there under the surface that perhaps I haven't really brought to the forefront and worked with in terms of reinforcing my spiritual practice? Because everything has made a kind of imprint on us to some degree. All these things, without a doubt, they're part of our mental landscape. But they're also really rich areas for mining, great meaning and purpose if we actually work with them. And that takes, again, a deeper discussion in terms of how would you do that. Initially, it might be through some forms of Western psychology, but Buddhist psychology is pretty complete in terms of giving us a lot of tools to work with as well, to recognize that all of those things are actually opportunities for us, again, to learn, to develop, to grow. You know, if we have certain things that have manifested in our lives, for example, it's often said that we have those because of the karma we've created for those that can be reversed through engaging in the opposite. So if we have, for example, the same one I used earlier of abandonment issues, where we feel like, okay, I was, treated in a way that ideally is not good, and we can acknowledge that. Once more, that's a moment of suffering. That's something that I can acknowledge. It's also part of our shared humanity that we all experience that to some degree. Well, then how I might want to treat myself and treat others better is to be focused on how do I make sure that others aren't abandoned, that I am tending to others, that I'm expressing concern for others' needs and engaging in their lives as well. So I don't know if I have more to say on it than that. I mean, John Wellwood's book is really quite nice in terms of going into much more detail about working with these concepts on a spiritual path, because that's his main aim in that book, is to really give us an opportunity as practitioners to investigate some of the tendencies that we have to be able to overcome those and not let them become obstacles. But anyway, I hope that helped a little, T-Joy. But I didn't catch everything from what you said, but that's just the problem of the sound system here. Sometimes it just depends. Certain microphones and systems or whatever, it doesn't come through quite as clear. But I saw there was something in the chat box. Yes, wasn't there something more? Let me go there real quickly. Is spiritual bias? Oh, that's the one. Okay, there it was in the chat box as well. I could have.
Donnie had something to say. If you can read past T. Joyce. Donnie just said she's trying to source the loving yourself quote that you mentioned earlier, and GPT has checked fake Buddha quotes. So
is that it? Yeah. It was a long wait because it's a long quote. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, that's where I cited where I saw that quote. I can't do more than that, it was again at this wonderful garden. If you ever get a chance to go up to Missoula, Montana, we have a center in Missoula, a small center, and they have this amazing place called the Garden of 1,000 Buddhas. And it was on one of the plaques, and I took a picture of it because I was like, wow, that's a pretty amazing quote. But again, it's possible that it's a fake quote. I really don't know. Mark, did you want to share something? Maybe we get the microphone to Mark. But thank you for looking at that.
As far as low self-esteem, lately it occurs to me that Mandrushri up there is whacking me with the sword.
The sword of wisdom.
Yeah, right. And I guess giving me the opportunity to observe my, I don't know. Yeah, I don't know how to say it. Yeah, showing up a little emptiness in the face of that suffering.
Yeah. You want to say more about that, Mark? Or?
I mean, when I feel bad or somebody doesn't like me or I don't like myself, there's just an infinite number of reasons and causes and illusions and truth in there. But the bottom line is I feel like I'm being split into emptiness for a second. If I pay attention to that.
Yeah. No, and again, what those of you who might not be as aware of the teaching that Mark's referring to on emptiness, I mean, this is that antidote to that second mind that I mentioned, the self-grasping, the tendency that we have of reifying the self, thinking there's this real me here that is going through all of these various experiences. These things are happening at a conventional level, but they aren't happening in the way that I think. And that wisdom sword that kind of cuts through all sense is the ideal antidote to and the final antidote to all of it. So obviously, yeah, I mean, that's something that if we can bring to bear at those times and have some awareness of that, that's really beneficial. But it takes a while to get there because you have to engage in an awful lot of study, practice, meditation, to kind of have that awareness. Anyway, yeah, thank you for sharing that, Mark. Was there anything else in the chat box? There was a lot in the chat box, but I can't go through it all myself and see what. Danny, did you have anything more to say? I don't know. Are you still with us? Yeah.
Laura, if you would like to unmute. Oh, she just says, thank you for the teachings.
Okay.
Greatly appreciated. And yeah, and then Donnie just said, if you read it, I guess that quote, read it. If not, it's not that important. It's just funny, kind of humorous. Glad you found it humorous.
Okay. Okay. All right. So maybe we should just go ahead and conclude for today since it is already.
I would like to say, earlier when you asked if we had anything in our meditation to rejoice, I think we could all probably rejoice that we got our butts out of bed and got to class today to learn some Dharma, and rejoice that we have a wonderful teaching with Gen Don, and we have another wonderful Venerable Dondrup, who teaches many of our classes. So there's the rejoicing. We're here rejoicing right now for that.
Yeah, and rejoicing that Venerable Rabina will be back next month, and then also that Geshe Sherip's returning at the end of May. So, and rejoicing in 25 years of the center, existing. So, yeah, I think all of you, there's a flyer out there if you're interested, a full day on May 31st of celebrating the 25 years of this organization being here. So, we can all rejoice in that. And it's good to end with this kind of rejoicing note, but also, of course, doing our dedication. So, T-Joy, thank you for sharing the screen, and we'll do the finishing prayer of some verses from Master Shantideva's text. Nancy, if you could lead that.
From Master Shantideva, may all beings everywhere, plagued by the sufferings of body and mind, obtain an ocean of happiness and joy by virtue of my merits. May no living creature suffer, commit evil, or ever fall ill. May no one be afraid or belittled with a mind weighed down by depression. May the blind see forms and the deaf hear sounds. May those whose bodies are worn with toil be restored on finding repose. May the naked find clothing, the hungry find food. May the thirsty find water and delicious drinks. May the poor find wealth, those weak with sorrow find joy. May the forlorn find hope, constant happiness, and prosperity. May there be timely rains and bountiful harvests. May all medicines be effective and wholesome prayers bear fruit. May all who are sick and ill quickly be freed from their ailments. Whatever diseases there are in the world, may they never occur again. May the frightened cease to be afraid, and those bound be freed. May the powerless find power, and may people think of benefiting each other. For as long as space remains, for as long as sentient beings remain, until then may I too remain to dispel the miseries of the world. Long life prayers for His Holiness the Dalai Lama. Gong Rei, Rei Wei, Kor Wei, Shin Kam Dir, Pandang Dewa Malu Zhu Wei Ne, Chen Re Zigwa Tenzin Gyatso Yi, Shabpe Site Pardu Ten Gyur Chi.
Lastly, we can dedicate for the recognition of Lama Zopa Rinpoche's reincarnation. As many of you know, I said he passed 2 years ago. His reincarnation born in Nepal, and there's a team of people who are searching for his reincarnation this time. So we're dedicating for his reincarnation for that reincarnation to be able to benefit ourselves and all beings in this world. for any other beings we're holding in our hearts, those we know who are experiencing obstacles, illness, who are dying or who have died, especially all of those who are on the prayer list here at Tukta Norbaling. And then, of course, anywhere else that we are thinking of beings who are suffering, who are going through difficulty at this time. We dedicate for their welfare. They can be free from their suffering and find all the causes of true happiness. And may all beings be free from all suffering, find perfect peace. We've done here together. Thank you all again for being here for today, as well as the classes I taught this month. And I will look forward to seeing you at the 25th anniversary, probably before that with Venerable Rabina's teachings. I'm going to be away for, again, part of it, but glad that I can be here for some of her teachings. So see you soon. Thank you all. Appreciate it.